Why don't we get to the substance, the essence of this notice of competition, which was released yesterday, 23rd of May, 2019. And we are sharing with you the essence in a hopefully much better structured way that will help you understand what exactly you need to do, what are the pitfalls, what do you need to pay attention to in order to maximize your chances of success at the competition. One important caveat, a disclaimer, everything that I tell you is not legally binding because it's certainly EPSO, the European Personal Selection Office, which has the ultimate say on all these matters, and they are the ones who are the author and the source of legally binding information. Obviously, we do everything that we can to provide you with the most accurate information. It might change from today to the moment you might be watching this webcast, if you're watching the recording later on. So be careful to learn and look into what is the most recent information that EPSO may have communicated since the airing of this particular information session. So with that, first question when it comes to the EPSO competitions, or more specifically the AD5 competition we're talking about today, where might you expect to work? This has a major impact on your family and professional obligations and your decision whether or not you would like to enroll in this selection test. A very easy answer to this one. The place of work is pretty much, there are two options, which is either Brussels or Luxembourg. We did mention Strasbourg for the sake of completeness, but Strasbourg is not a place where the institutions will be hiring AD5 officials. Actually, they are extremely limited. There's barely any EU official working in Strasbourg. A lot of officials go there because the European Parliament's official seat is in Strasbourg, but you're not going to be based there as an EU official. So it's essentially Brussels and Luxembourg where you eventually may be hired. So with that, let's go to the next point, which is where or which EU institution may hire you once you have completed the selection test. And this is the point where I would like to underline one important aspect. We use the term selection and we use the term recruitment. EPSO is the European Personal Selection Office. They are not recruitment. They're not an internal recruitment agency. They select suitable, appropriate candidates who have passed the various steps of the selection tests and eventually place you on a reserve list. You are recruitable only after that point. So once you're on the reserve list, various EU institutions, the ones that I show on the screen, these are the ones that can hire you, that can recruit you. There's a slightly different process from time to time when it comes to the recruitment of temporary agents, but this is not something we will cover in this particular webinar. We will look at that separately. We're only focusing on the current AD5, so administrator at the level of 5 selection process and what it entails. So to underline the previous point, there are these EU institutions, which is European Commission, Council of Ministers, the European Parliament, the Economic and Social Committee, the Committee of the Regions, the European Court of Justice, and that's pretty much it. So the European institutions that can hire, and the European Court of Auditors, which I didn't mention in the previous list. So these are the institutions that can recruit from the reserve list that you will be placed on once you have successfully completed the various steps of the competition. Now, this is actually decided only in the very end. You will not know in advance, and you cannot decide in advance which institution might hire you. That depends on the current need of a given institution at the moment when they have an HR, a human resources need to hire new staff. So with that, let's go to the next point. So with the AD5, basically there are a fixed number of places on the reserve list. It's 147. That's how many candidates will end up on the reserve list and will be in the position to be hired by the institutions. Each competition has a reference number. So for this one, it's 373/19, referring to 2019. This is the reference number that you need to look out for in every communication that you may have with EPSO or the selection board. Make sure to apply before the deadline, that's the 25th of June, so pretty much a month from now. Again, with the caveat, if you might be watching this as a recording, that may not be a month. Be absolutely sure that you apply on time and don't leave it to the last moment. Make sure you dedicate 30 minutes, 1 hour to complete each and every field in the application form. Some candidates leave it to the last minute, and then EPSO's servers might crash, or you might get some emergency and you will not be able to fill out all the forms, or you may not pay such a close attention to every little detail, and then the repercussions will be felt when you are invited to the exam and perhaps you did not choose the right language in which you are most proficient to complete the tests. So make sure that you dedicate enough time and attention to filling out the form properly and in time. Let's go to the next point, whether you are eligible. Now, almost all EU citizens are eligible. So as long as you have the citizenship of the 28 member states, and we're recording this on the 24th of May, Brexit has still not happened. Who knows whether it will or not. In any case, even British citizens are fully eligible because they are full members of the EU, just like all the 27 countries. So if you have the citizenship of the 28 EU member states, you are most likely eligible. There are a couple of formal but general requirements. You need to have completed military service, you need to have the character requirements that the job entails, and the citizenship criterion I have already mentioned. Language rules. This is fundamentally a truly important part of the information session and the application process. So let's spend a few minutes understanding the different language rules. There have been a couple of court cases where various candidates and occasionally even member states would challenge EPSO's rules on the language process, making sure that their citizens or those citizens who speak a particular language are not discriminated against. So there have been a number of changes and legal tweaks when it comes to choosing the languages and how EPSO formulates the notice of competition in order to ensure that no language speaker, and I'm not using the term citizen, but no language speaker is discriminated against for the lack of knowledge of a given language. So let's look at it a little closer. First, there's the term of language 1, and then there's language 2. Language 1 is pretty much your mother tongue, but I don't like to use that term because it's not legally accurate. It has to be one of the 24 official languages of the EU. So I'm Hungarian, I speak Hungarian as a native speaker, but I'm fairly good in English, so I may as well choose as language 1 English. But I could choose basically any other language in which I feel I'm fluent enough to express myself verbally and in writing. So language 1 is a fairly free choice, and the only criterion is that it has to be one of the 24 languages that the EU recognizes as an official language. And then there is the language 2. Now language 2 is where the system gets a little complicated. It's not that complicated, but it's something to be mindful of. What is language 2? Well, language 2 will be, and I read it, the top 5 languages indicated by the applicants that match the needs of the EU institutions. That's a pretty strange way of expressing which languages will be chosen. Again, I'm pointing back to the earlier court cases, making sure that EPSO is not only democratically corresponding to the expectations of European citizens, making sure that all the language diversity we have in Europe is properly reflected. At the same time, it has to be efficient. It has to be workable with the various steps of the selection process. So what does it mean in practice? In practice is what you see on the screen. They need to pick the 5 most popular, as in most spoken languages that the candidates have chosen in their application form. So another important element of this is that language 2, your choice of language 2 must be different from language 1. So again, going back to my own personal example, I may choose English as language 1 and I could choose Hungarian as language 2. Legally, technically, that's entirely possible and I would not be excluded from the competition yet, because the twist in this is that they will look at what are the top 5 languages. Now, Hungarian is most likely not going to be among those top 5 languages, so I would pretty much shoot myself in the foot by choosing Hungarian as language 2 instead of language 1. So the language 2 has to be, as mentioned before, one of those popular languages that other candidates are likely or have likely chosen as well. An indication of what those top 5 might be, let's look at what happened last year. Last year, the following languages were chosen. You can see English, very, very popular, then French, Spanish, Italian, and German. So the chances are, if you choose one of these 5 as language 2, you will be in a safe place and you can proceed with the rest of the, not just the application, but the selection process as well. Bottom line, I would suggest that as language 1, you choose pretty much whatever language you feel most comfortable in expressing yourself, and also in writing, and even in reading comprehension, because that will determine the pre-selection phase. Whereas language 2 has to be a language in which you can really express yourself in a live setting, in an interview, in an oral presentation, in a group exercise, where you are most comfortable in, and it's among, or it's one of these languages that you see on the screen. Again, this is sort of a friendly advice. This is what we're recommending you to do. It's something that will hopefully maximize your chances of success in the process. Now let me take a quick look at questions, if there is any, so I can answer it to right away. I see one coming in where it says EU agencies are not included in the potential places of work for AD5. Do they not have access to the final reserve list? Well, the main rule when it comes to EU agencies is that they are not, legally speaking, EU institutions. They are agencies, and there are a number of EU bodies. And those, as a main rule, are not, they do not have access to hire permanent staff, AD5 or other permanent staff from these reserve lists. Occasionally there are exceptions to that rule. So you have the, what used to be called the OAMI, the trademark office and intellectual property office based in Alicante, Spain. So they had a special agreement with EPSO, and then they have now a few, whether they are EU officials or unlimited temporary contracts, which sounds like a bit an oxymoron, but they have a special situation in which they could do that. But that's rather the exception and not the rule when it comes to EU agencies. EU agencies typically hire temporary agents and contract staff. So with that, let's go on to the next part and discuss various other angles of the AD5 selection process. What qualifications and work experience do you need? Well, essentially you need a degree issued by a recognized university in the EU, or if it's from outside the EU, you probably need to have the equivalency or homologation, I think there's a technical term for that, to have it recognized by an EU ministry, one of the member states' Ministry of Education or Accreditation Authority. Once you have, it's pretty much a BA, so Bachelor of Arts degree. Once you have that, that's pretty much all you need. You are not required to have any work experience whatsoever. Having work experience does not preclude you, does not exclude you from the competition. So if you have a degree, at least a bachelor, and no work experience, you're eligible. If you have a PhD and 5 years of work experience, you're also eligible. Sometimes, in very practical terms, you might have a better chance of being recruited with some work experience. But again, for the sake or for the purposes of the selection process, this is not a prerequisite. In terms of the degree, when you have or when you receive that degree, you need to get that by, I think, the 31st of July, pretty much when the academic year typically closes. So you can already apply even if you are in your last years of studies and you are still eligible for the competition. And then when it comes to the languages, it's pretty much with the rules of with the language 1 and language 2, the way we discussed, and you need to choose those according to the rules that we just covered. Having that in place and filling out the form and submitting it on time, you should by all means be eligible to sit the competition. Right. Why is it a great opportunity? I probably don't need to preach to the converted. You are already pretty convinced that this is a great opportunity, not just for the various benefits that you would receive. Salaries are very attractive at the EU institution. The starting salary for an AD5 is typically around 4,000 euros net, with various other benefits that come on top. When it comes to the other benefits I've mentioned, you do get a pretty extensive health insurance, not just for you, but for your spouse. You also get various other, like a good access to the healthcare facilities with a good reimbursement scheme as well. Children get access to European schools, which abound in Brussels. Even there are some new ones opening where they can study in their native language, depending on the composition of the household in terms of languages and nationalities. So with that, this is a pretty good package that institutions offer, and certainly there is more to it. It's not just the salaries, which is nevertheless a very important aspect. It's also your commitment to the idea of European integration. And this is something we'll come back to, because one of the tests that you will be required to sit in the process is called motivational interview. And that's exactly that they would like to test and ask you about: what is your motivation? Why would you like to work for the European institutions? Most probably European Commission. What is it that draws you to this job? Is it your commitment to European values? Is it working in an international organization? Is it because you like working in a multicultural environment? There could be various aspects and facets to your response. Let's actually look at the various steps and parts of the selection process, where the part one, eligibility and language declaration, is pretty straightforward, where you would make sure that you meet all the criteria that's required of you to apply, as we discussed earlier, and making sure that the languages are carefully chosen. So do think about it carefully, which one is going to be language 1, language 2, and declare other languages that you may speak at a sufficiently fluent and good level. Once you've done that, or actually make sure that you declare all of this in the application. If you happen to speak 3-4 languages, then do not hide it. Make sure that you rank it and indicate the appropriate level to ensure that you're not excluded from the competition once the top 5 languages for language 2 are chosen. Deadline 25th of June. I think we mentioned that before. So once EPSO reviews all the applicants after the 25th of June, after the application has closed, and they do their data crunching and say, okay, here are the top 5 languages that were declared as language 2, and if yours is not among them, unfortunately, you're excluded from the competition. So that's why it becomes such a crucial factor in ensuring you can be part of the process throughout. Full application, it happens when you are sort of chosen at that point, or you are allowed to pass to the next stage. That's when your full list of qualifications need to be declared. So that is your university degree or the bachelor degree that you have obtained, and perhaps any other qualification that you consider relevant from the job perspective. And at that point, pretty much the process begins, and EPSO says, okay, we're good, you were ready, this is how many candidates have applied, and now we can start the actual selection process. And making sure that you validate your declarations and you confirm all the data you have put into the system whenever you are prompted to do so. EPSO does not send out emails for some reason. Perhaps it's a liability question because they don't want to be held liable whether or not they have notified you. They might change this in the future, or they may have different systems in place. But in any case, make sure you check your EPSO profile on a weekly basis, because they might request additional information from you. They might request some declaration or confirmation of sorts. We at EU Training, we're trying our best to keep you updated. So whenever there's a major news that has been put out, we will notify you. We'll put that information into the various Facebook groups that we are part of or we're monitoring. We're trying to inform you as best as we can, but as I mentioned before, it's only EPSO that has the authentic or the first information that you should rely on. So the deadline for the full application is something EPSO will announce, certainly after the 25th of June, once you've done your initial application. Hard to guess when that's going to be, possibly midsummer, possibly early September, possibly early August, cannot tell. So make sure that you keep an eye out for that. And as I mentioned before, we do our best to keep you updated to make sure you do not miss a thing. And here we get to the point of what actually you need to do to succeed at the competition. And I'll take a quick peek at my messenger to see if there is any other question that has come in. There is one actually that I might want to answer. So the question is, what is the advantage or disadvantage to applying to multiple posts in parallel? So for example, not only applying for this current AD5, but to other CAST competition, which has no deadline. So just for those who may not be aware, CAST, so C-A-S-T, that refers to contract agents for specific tasks. It's a contract agent selection process, which is independent of the current AD5 competition. And you can apply for that in parallel, no limitations whatsoever. Generally, the rule of thumb is that you can apply to as many competitions as you like, unless it's specifically written in the notice of competition that there's a conflict between two competitions. So I know some people who have 2 or 3 applications that they put in and they have applied to all these competitions. They sit various tests. Occasionally it's good for practice. Sometimes it's more serious because they're truly interested in that specific field. So it's entirely up to you how many you would like to take part in. But just to reiterate, the CAST exams, so the C-A-S-T exams, those are an ongoing open-ended tests with a slightly different method. And you can find a lot of information about that on our website on eutraining.eu. Make sure to look at that because that might be an additional opportunity on top of the current one. Let's go back to the pre-selection part and look at the various tests that you will be required to sit. 4 tests in the pre-selection, so verbal reasoning, numerical reasoning, abstract reasoning, and a so-called situational judgment test, or for the EPSO geeks, it's SJT. Let's look at these one by one and understand what each of one entails. One important note, the SJT, the situational judgment test, is administered in language 2. The other 3 are done in language 1. So that's an important distinction to make. Again, pointing back to the earlier piece of advice, make sure to choose your language carefully depending on your fluency or proficiency in each of those. So let's look at the verbal reasoning. Verbal reasoning is sort of a reading comprehension test. Many of you might be familiar with that. In various national systems, perhaps in the UK or in France, they tend to use similar systems. Here are the specificities that EPSO uses. So you have 10 questions and you have 18 minutes in total to answer those questions. So that's not a lot. It's less than 2 minutes per question. So you need to read fast, judge fast, and answer the best option fast. There is always a text passage. There's always a question. And there are multiple options, answer options, usually 4 statements. And there's one correct answer that you can choose. So it's not about choosing the wrong answer. It's not about choosing the odd one out. One correct statement is what you need to choose. A couple of ideas and methodology in a nutshell that I can share with you at this point. So sometimes they put so-called outside information into the text. So if I take an example of, say, well, Brexit, it's probably on the top of everyone's mind these days following European politics. And there might be a piece of information there which you know from the press, but it's not in the text. So if the text talk about British members of the European Parliament, how they are elected, and then there is a reference to Theresa May, who is at least today still the Prime Minister, that might be in the text and you know of it. But if there's no reference to the person, just to the position of Prime Minister, but you know the name of that prime minister because you've been following political news, that actually might confuse you. That's an outside information that is there to trick you, where the text did not mention it, but you know it from elsewhere. Then there are a couple of other things, generalizations. So if they say one person versus a number of people, or they say this is commonly known, these nuances play an important role, and the statement you choose may not be accurate on that basis. Then there is also possibility versus fact. So if there's a little word of may or might or similar included, that changes the entire meaning of a sentence. And then there's similar wording, sometimes using synonyms, sometimes just words which are close enough, but they do not necessarily mean the same thing. Hence, your reading comprehension and vocabulary play a very important role in that regard. This is the first test. Number 2, numerical reasoning. It's still being done in language 1, based on your choice. It's always a chart or some sort of a complex data sheet that you need to analyze and come to, or basically finding the correct answer on the basis of the information that you were presented with. How do you do that? You do correlations, you do calculations, and ultimately you pick the right answer. So the kind of things you need to do in being successful for the numerical reasoning are the following 4. You need to interpret the data. What is the data that I'm presented with? And I need to choose the ones or the little pieces that are actually relevant to solving this task. Even if you have a huge, very complex chart, you probably don't need to look at all the numbers and figures in it. What you need to do is actually focusing on 2 or 3 data points that you can turn into a calculation. So you do the reasoning. How do I need to crunch those numbers? Perhaps you can estimate or guesstimate, and you don't need to use the calculator, which you are provided with, by the way, an on-screen and sometimes even a physical calculator in the room, so you can tap away and do the mathematical operations. But often it's faster, quicker, more efficient to just estimate. And then finally, you might need to calculate the exact numbers if that's truly necessary. As a result, the same idea applies. You need to choose the one correct answer from among multiple options. You have 10 questions, 20 minutes. So again, you have pretty much 2 minutes per question. That's not a lot, and you need to be fast to come to the appropriate, to the right result on time. And then you have the abstract reasoning, everyone's favorite. This was meant to be a cynical comment because most candidates dread abstract reasoning. Depends on your taste, depends on your mindset, depends on how you feel about it. But abstract reasoning looks pretty much like this. And this is not a Rorschach test where your psychological associative imagination is being tested. You need to find logic in the movement of the different patterns and the different items on the screen. So whether the little square moves according to a certain logic, or the filled in or the blank one moves in relation to the other, and then you need to choose the right answer of which is the next in the sequence. Here you have 20 questions and 20 minutes. So this is difficult for a reason. It's 1 question per minute or 1 minute per question. And that's really little time. So practicing and understanding methodology there becomes a crucial item. And even more so because, as we will see in a few moments, the scoring of this test has become even more important than the others. So that's the abstract reasoning. And then the last one in the pre-selection sequence is the one we call situational judgment test. To remind you, this is done in language 2, not language 1. So that might change slightly your approach to it. Situational judgment tests are pretty much, how should I summarize it? Well, you see on the screen a sample where you have 20 questions in 30 minutes. So the timing there is not particularly difficult. This is an approach where there's a situation presented to you, often work-related, and not just any work-related, but a work in the EU institutions. So understanding the values, the system, the processes, the mindset of EU institutions becomes important because you need to imagine yourself being an EU official and then decide what's the best course of action I should take in this particular situation. So it's interesting. It's often criticized, saying this is not an exact science of what's the best way to proceed. I do vouch for the best practices, how these tests are developed, because it's done by occupational psychologists and experts in that field, and they say this does correspond to measurable, validated results, and it helps the selection process. While I do acknowledge that there is a tiny bit of subjectivity in these tests. The good news is we offer you dozens and dozens such tests on our website. You can practice those. We have an ebook on the methodology. There's a lot of knowledge to be had in order to understand what these tests entail. So that's the pre-selection part. And it's worth looking a little bit at the scoring, because that matters a lot on where you focus your attention and your energy in your preparation. So actually, let me go back for a second. There's one important point: when these tests are expected to take place, most likely in September and October. And that pretty much makes sense, given that the various preceding steps of the process need to take place in the coming weeks, and then usually in August there is a summer break, and the institutions work slower because of vacations. So it does make sense, and it seems reasonable that these tests are going to take place in September and October. It is not yet confirmed, so keep your eyes open, and then you will be notified by us and then in your EPSO profile when you need to choose an exam date. Just as a side note, you can choose an exam date. So it's not that all of these tests are happening on the same day for everyone. That used to be many, many years ago, but currently there is a frame of a couple of weeks, and you can choose the date that suits you best, and you can sit those tests even not beyond Brussels, so basically anywhere in Europe, but even beyond Europe. So typically EPSO would have contracts with various test centers which are accredited, and then whether it's Washington, DC, or perhaps even in Beijing or faraway places, you can sit the pre-selection tests. Let's look at the actual scoring part, because that's really important. The verbal reasoning and the numerical reasoning, you need to pass those tests. And that's pretty much it. So you need to have at least 50% of the score. So out of 10, you need to have 5 for the verbal reasoning. Out of 10 for the numerical reasoning, again, you need to have at least 5 points. But that's it. Whether you have 5 or you have 10, it doesn't matter from the perspective of your success or your chance to proceed to the next stage. What does matter to a great extent is really the abstract reasoning and the situational judgment test. So there, the abstract reasoning, you need to have a pass mark, so at least 10 points. And for the situational judgment test, you need to have 24 out of 40. So that's a little higher threshold. But then it's not enough just to pass. You need to pass with a high score, because there's actually a ranking among the candidates of who has the highest scores, and this is how EPSO, or more specifically the selection board, which is supervising and overseeing this particular competition, will decide where's the cutoff point and who can be invited to the next stage. So the abstract reasoning and situational judgment test, these are the exams that you really need to focus a lot of attention on to make sure that you not only pass, but you pass with a very, very high mark. Having said that, do not neglect or ignore the verbal and the numerical reasoning, because you must have 50%, and some candidates say, oh, that's easy to have 50%, and then they just take it too lightly, and they might be excluded from the competition because they didn't reach 50% for either of these two. Having seen the pre-selection, let's take a look at the next step, what is called intermediate step. This is a relatively new thing, introduced roughly 3 years ago, if I'm not mistaken. It is essentially one exercise, an E-tray exercise. This is administered in language 2, just like the situational judgment test. And this is done only after you have passed the pre-selection. So not everyone gets to the E-tray exercise, only those who have the sufficient score from the pre-selection. Approximately 10 times the number of candidates sought will be invited to this stage. So you do the maths. Ultimately, there are 147 candidates who will be placed on the reserve list. So the roughly 1,400, 1,500 candidates are expected to be invited to the E-Tray exam. So you see the numbers there, and here's a sample E-Tray exercise, which as the name suggests, it's based on emails, and emails that you need to read through, a number of emails with lots of information in them, sometimes conflicting information, and you need to find the best course of action or how you should respond or to react to them, based on a scale of 5 points. So the least appropriate to the most appropriate answers you need to choose, and then there is a special scoring grid, a special scoring system that you need to that you will be faced with, and on that basis they will decide your ultimate score and then decide whether you can proceed to the next stage or not. So in terms of the points, the E-Tray exercise is actually based on competencies, and the term competencies comes back when we go to the third step, which is the assessment center. But already at the E-Tray part, EPSO looks at to what degree do you possess, and again I'm using EPSO, but it's actually a selection board which is unique to each competition. So the selection board will look at the existence of certain competencies and do the scoring accordingly. These competencies are the ones you see on the screen. So analysis and problem solving, delivering quality and results, prioritizing and organizing, and working with others. So based on your answers, they will determine a certain score. You need to have, or you can get 10 points per competency, but you need to have at least 4 per competency. And you won't necessarily know which question relates to which competency. So all you need to do is focus on answering the questions to the best of your abilities, but then they will turn that into a special scoring grid and give you a score which will determine whether or not you pass to the next stage or not. And you need to be among the top candidates to qualify for the assessment center. This is essentially step number 3. So pre-selection, intermediate, which is the E-Tray, and then the assessment center. So assessment center, they will invite approximately 2 times the number of candidates sought to be placed on the reserve list. So roughly 300-ish candidates, 350-ish candidates will be invited to the assessment center. The assessment center has various exams in it. It's usually a 1-day exercise, though the case study typically happens a bit earlier, because case study usually is, not usually, but these days, always computer-based. So you need to go to a test center to sit the case study. But legally speaking or procedurally speaking, it's part of the assessment center. The other exams in the assessment center are the ones you see on the screen. So the oral presentation, the group exercise, and the competency-based interview, or for short, CBI. And then there is another test, which is relatively new. It was introduced last year in the competition, the motivational interview. This is what I referred to earlier, where your motivation to work for European institutions is being tested. So they will ask you questions not only about why would you want to work for one particular EU institution, but they will ask you about your knowledge of European integration, the decision-making processes on European level, your understanding of how the institutions work and operate. So this is where your personal drive and a bit of knowledge of the European integration questions will be tested. The good news is we provide tons of materials, training courses, webinars, all sorts of educational materials to all of these. So there's a lot of material you can find on our website, and we are available to answer questions, whatever they may refer to in this regard. And then the final point there, the scoring. So in the assessment center, that's where these competencies are. And there are 8 competencies, and I won't list all of them. These are readily available on EPSO's websites. We also have a lot of materials on them. And these are the ones that these concrete specific tests will measure. You need to have at least 3 points per competency, so that's the pass mark, and at least 50 points out of 80. But then there's a ranking based on the performance of other candidates, and you need to be among the top ones. So the motivational interview is outside of this. So there you can get 10 points and you need to have at least 5 out of 10. But with proper preparation, with understanding what they're looking for, looking into yourself and understanding your true motivations and expressing it in the best possible way will get you through that, no problem. So with that, that's pretty much the scoring system. Just for the sake of completeness, to the assessment center, they will add the E-tray exercise scores as well. So that will be part of the overall scoring you receive in the assessment center. So the E-tray is truly an important part of the entire process because it follows you throughout. I hope this is clear. I know there's a lot of data and a lot of stuff there. Ultimately, if all goes well, which we truly think will, and we are here to help you, is you are placed on the reserve list where the number of places is already determined. That's 147, as you know. There is a validity of each reserve list, generally 1 year, or in some cases until the same kind of competition is announced sometime later. But in the case of 85, that's pretty much annual. So this list is most likely going to be valid for 1 year, through which time you can be recruited. And we also have actually a webinar exactly on that, of how you can facilitate or increase your chances, improve your chances of getting hired once you are on the reserve list. And then the recruitment happens, as we said before, depending on your profile, the institution's needs at the time, they will invite you for a job interview and offer you a position. And that's when you open a champagne, or if you're recruited in Belgium, you open a nice Belgian beer and you celebrate and perhaps send us a message that we contributed to your hard work and success. So how do you get the job? A couple of common general ideas. Practice a lot. Do practice for many, many weeks. And I often compare the preparation to sports preparation, that most people who may not be in good health, they can walk and they can run, but they most likely cannot do the 20K Brussels Marathon or semi-marathon. So you need to be in good shape mentally and dedicated with focus to make sure that you are able to sit those tests and perform at your best self. Prepare regularly, whether it's 30 minutes every day or 15 minutes every morning or every second day, entirely up to you. It has to be regular. Again, just like with any sort of skill development, if you're learning a new language, it's really not gonna just go into your brain by putting some textbook under your pillow. You need to do a lot for it and practice on a regular basis. And then learn methodology. Make sure that you understand there are a lot of best practices to the preparation. I mentioned some of these resources and materials that are out there. You can definitely find certain shortcuts or good ideas how to read quickly. You can train your quick reading skills. You can train your ability of identifying patterns in the abstract reasoning, or learning or reading a couple of resources to prepare for the situational judgment test. For the assessment center, there's a lot you can do because there are classroom courses, you can practice with colleagues and friends. So there is a method to it if you dedicate enough time to look into that. And then the persistence is a very important part. A lot of candidates may give up or just lose motivation. So perhaps you want to form a study group or join forces with a couple of friends or colleagues who are also preparing, so you can motivate each other and you don't look at each other as competition, but as more of a preparation team. And then doing lots of simulation certainly helps, especially if you're not so comfortable or familiar with the system or the methodology. So let me take a quick look before we look at the special offer and a couple of other resources, because I see questions coming in. Here's one. You succeeded and you will finally be on the reserve list. How can you increase your chances to be hired? How does it work? I mentioned that there's a webinar I did some time ago, and it's available on our website. There's a lot you can do in identifying the persons who may hire you based on your background and on your profile, how to optimize your CV or resume for American English speakers, how you can send the best message through a cover letter and an email. So there are a lot of small ideas and tricks to that, which you may want to look at once you're hired. You can definitely increase your chances of actually getting a job. Another question, looks like the best strategy is put your best language as language 2. are there more tests in this language? Is it so? Well, it really depends. It's hard to answer without knowing what your first language or second language might be. And I would not start to second guess where you might be coming from based on your first name. So it really depends. If you're a French and Spanish speaker, that's different from being, say, a Czech and Lithuanian speaker. So these are different situations where some languages are just more accessible given the number of candidates who speak that as well. And one more question before I go back to our slides. There's a big difference between your ultimate AD test book and the questions on EU Training EU. That's very kind of you to ask, because one of the recommended resources, very selfishly, is not just the eutraining.eu website, where you can see the verbal, numerical, abstract reasoning samples, which reflect 100%, or let's say 99% on how EPSO's interface actually looks like. This is the situational judgment test. But I would also recommend the book that I've written, which is called the Ultimate EU Test Book. And to answer that question, the questions are completely different. There's zero overlap between what's in the book and what's on the website. Going back to the website for a second, to call your attention to these two interesting features where you can do tests or take tests in practice mode, where there's no timer and you can take it at your ease. And then there's exam mode, which truly simulates how EPSO presents that at the exam center. And then a couple of other ideas, resources, webinars. So the tests online are available in 19 languages, which is something we're really proud of. And hopefully we can contribute to your preparation success, no matter, or almost no matter, where you might be coming from or which language you speak. These are verbal reasoning tests that you can have and practice on the interface, from Croatian to Greek to Bulgarian to many other languages. The flags you can see on the screen. Numerical reasoning we have available in English and French and Spanish. And then abstract reasoning we have in English and French. And then the situational judgment test is English, French, and German. So for abstract reasoning, for understandable reasons, language is not really important given the shapes and the figures, which are the highlight of the exercise. For verbal reasoning, that's where truly the linguistic part becomes important. And there are tons of methodology resources. I will quickly run through these. So there are webinars. Many of these are free. So for the abstract verbal numerical reasoning, you can get access to these. There are pro tips, and there's even a math refresher if you have left school long ago. Perhaps you studied linguistics or other studies where math was not a prominent subject at university. You can refresh basic algebra and arithmetics and stuff like that. And then classroom training. Do join our classroom trainings. You're more than welcome in Brussels. If there's interest and if there's demand in other places, so whether it's Italy or France or Spain or Romania, wherever it may be, we're happy to organize a classroom training for a group. So with that, there's also e-tray exercise, which is only relevant a bit later, and various case study simulations, assessment center simulations, which we do on an almost weekly basis, mostly in Brussels, but as I mentioned, elsewhere as well. So check those out with the ebooks, with the tips and tricks. Send us questions. We love getting questions from you, because it not only we are happy to help all the candidates, but it also gives us interesting, important information to understand what you might be struggling with, so you can provide services for that particular need. Join the Facebook groups that we put out there. Sometimes it's not us, sometimes it's other candidates, but join those to have meaningful discussions around exam preparation, sometimes rumors, sometimes ideas on what's the best way to crack the code of these exams and the tests. Here's the book that the person who sent that question was referencing, the EU test book, and we just came out with a new edition, the 2019 edition, a couple of weeks ago. So that it's not brand new questions, certain percentage are new questions, but it's updated and it has the most up-to-date methodology information as well. And then there's the assessment center book, where you can get sample exercises, simulations, and understand the logic and the idea behind the competency assessment. And here we got to the point with the special discount offer. You can use this code for 48 hours as of this point. It's my AD5 2019. It's all caps, so make sure that you spell it correctly, and you can use it for all the online products that we have available on the website for 2 days. And while you're looking at it, I will look at a couple of other questions that have come in, because we have about 5 minutes or so left before we finish off. So another question, is there a possibility to be on the reserve list and not get hired? And that's important, and let's be completely honest and transparent about this. Unfortunately, yes. So some candidates do get placed on the reserve list and they are not hired within the validity timeframe of the reserve list. This is very unfortunate, and it's a lose-lose situation that neither of the parties is interested in getting to. So obviously candidates who enrolled and went through these various steps of the competition, they want to be hired. There's a reason why they put in so much time and effort and energy. On the institution side, understandably, they also want to hire this number of people. There's a reason why they picked the 147 in this case. They want to test those candidates and make sure that they fill a need that the institutions have for human resources. And if they cannot hire the sufficient number of staff, that is a lot of loss in their resources and time and effort to put the exams out. So overall, there's a joint interest in hiring everyone on the reserve list. Unfortunately, it doesn't always happen, and sometimes it doesn't happen for the candidate's choice. Some candidates had their life circumstances change. They travel abroad or move abroad, or their family circumstances change, or their preference for a job changes, and they decide not to take a job offer they might be offered. So there are multiple reasons to it, but generally let's use this marketing term, conversion rate, so the number of people from the reserve list eventually hired, is relatively high. I think it's around 80, 85, perhaps even 90%. Would need to check the exact figure, but it's really pretty high. Another question that I'm looking at. So yes, there was with the EU test book, whether there's an overlap between previous and new editions. Send me an email and I'm happy to point you, depending on which previous edition you have, how much overlap there is. Another question, what about JRC? That's the Joint Research Center of the European Commission. It's part of the European Commission. Will they have access to the reserve list? Yes. So JRC typically, actually I won't put this down, I might have some questions. JRC generally has access to the reserve list. Sometimes there are dedicated competitions for researchers in various fields. So that they are indeed part of the system, part of the institutional setup, the institutions that can hire from the reserve list. Let me look at others. Is there an age limit to apply for the AD5 concours? And funny enough, only in the very end do I use this, the French term, by which the competitions have traditionally been known. So concours, it means competition, but even English speakers often tended to refer to the concours in its French homonym. So is there an age limit? No, there is no age limit. Certainly there is an age limit, there's a retirement age in the institutions, but that's a different matter. The upper age limit is not defined. That would be discriminatory. So no matter what your age is, well, not in absolute terms, but if you are within the retirement age, there's no upper limit. So whether you are a fresh graduate out of university or you're 35 or 45, you can apply for the AD5 competitions just like anyone else, provided you go through the tests as others and you meet all the other criteria. Maybe one or two more questions. You recommended to spend more preparation with the abstract and SJT, so the situational judgment test, than verbal and numerical reasoning, or the same time. Probably not the same time. So if you are fairly confident that you can reach 50% for the verbal and numerical reasoning, then focus your energy on the abstract and the situational judgment test, because there you not only need to pass, but you need to pass with a very high score. So there you really need to perform extremely well, whereas for the verbal and numerical reasoning, you need to perform good enough. So that determines your preparation strategy. Another aspect for your preparation strategy, what is your current situation? Where are your strengths and weaknesses? So you might be very number oriented and someone who's very good with numbers and figures. So you may need much less preparation for the numerical reasoning, perhaps the abstract, and your literacy, the reading comprehension part, might be more challenging. So certainly that determines how much effort you then spend on the verbal reasoning and the situational judgment tests as well. Maybe one or two more questions before we finish. You are offered one job and turn it down. Does it mean you won't get offered another one? Well, this is a bit of, in psychology, they call it the prisoner's dilemma. So if I turn this down, will I get a better chance afterwards, or should I rather play it safe and accept it? I say if the job offer you might get in the end is good enough, it's like, okay, I would say take it, because there's an internal mobility system in the commission, but also among the institutions, where you can keep your grade level, you can keep your salary, and move to another job. So you start somewhere, and perhaps after 2 years or so, you should be able to move to another position. So unless it's really a kind of job that you absolutely dislike, consider accepting it. But even if you turn it down, there's a good chance you might be offered another one, but certainly there's a bit of gamble in that. And then the final question before we finish off, there's no restriction in terms of language 1, but can you be excluded from language 2 if your language has not been selected? And I'm happy to finish with this question because this is a fundamental point. You can be excluded indeed. Make sure that your language 2 is among the expected or anticipated top languages, so you do not risk being excluded for having chosen a language 2, which is not among the most popular ones. As mentioned before, if you have other questions, if you have comments, if you like this, share it with others, tell others about the webcast, about the transcript, about the information, about the competitions, unless you really do not want them to be additional competition for you, which is completely understandable. But we're here to help you. We're here to assist you with your questions or dilemmas or challenges in your preparation. Send us an email. It's always free. We will be very happy to answer you, generally within 24 hours. If it's a little more complex, give us more time, but we will always get back to you on various platforms and challenges. So thank you so much for being here with us, with me today, virtually and physically. And as mentioned before, send us messages, ask and share good news with us if you have passed one of the stages. Hopefully we can contribute to your success. And a special thanks to all the technical team for making such a smooth operation on our live stream, but the recording will be available very soon along with the transcript. So to the Budapest team, to the Brussels team, big thank you, and to all the viewers wherever you may be in the world, thank you very much for spending the past 60 minutes with us with EU training, and wishing you lots of success in your preparation. Stay tuned.